Apple turns 50 today, and the question no one at the birthday party wants to answer out loud is whether the company's most famous quality, its legendary patience, has quietly become its biggest liability. I've spent 15 years running this company on one promise: don't ship first, ship right. That promise built 2.5 billion active devices, a $3.8 trillion market cap, and a relationship with customers most companies can't imagine. But the AI era just rewrote the rules, and the hardest part of this story isn't the delays or the lawsuits. It's something quieter and more dangerous that we'll get to at the end. So pull up a chair. This is a story about a company trying to protect an idea, and the very real question of whether that idea is wisdom or a speed limit. Let's go back to the beginning. On April 1st, 1976, three people, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne, founded Apple Computer Co. with a radical belief. Technology should feel personal, not institutional, not intimidating. Personal. That belief became a competitive strategy unlike anything the industry had seen. Apple wasn't first to the MP3 player. Diamond Multimedia's Rio arrived in 1998, years before Apple shipped a single music device. Then the iPod landed in 2001, and within 2 years, Apple owned 70% of the digital music market. They weren't first to the smartphone. BlackBerries and Nokia communicators existed long before 2007, but when the iPhone arrived, it didn't compete with those devices. It made them feel like prototypes. The Apple Watch, Pebble, Samsung, Motorola all shipped wearables before Apple in 2015. By 2017, Apple was selling more watches than the entire Swiss watch industry combined. Not first, but right, every single time. By January 2026, Apple had surpassed 2.5 billion active devices worldwide. Fiscal year 2025 net sales hit $416 billion. Services revenue, a business that barely existed 15 years ago, reached $109 billion. And when I wrote Apple's 50th anniversary message, I didn't lead with any of those numbers. I led with this: your trust drives us to do better. 9 words, the whole thesis. 50 years of choosing trust over speed. It worked, until the world started moving faster than the philosophy was designed for. Here's where it gets complicated. In June 2024, I stood in the Steve Jobs Theater. Lights down, one spotlight on stage, 2,000 people holding their breath, and introduced Apple Intelligence. The centerpiece was a transformed Siri, more personal, more capable, woven into everything an iPhone knows about you. I called it generative AI in a way that only Apple can deliver. I meant every word. By March 7, 2025, we confirmed that many of the most significant Siri improvements were delayed until 2026. Bloomberg reported that Siri chief Robbie Walker described the situation internally as ugly and embarrassing. This is a company that runs on polish, on never showing weakness before it's solved. And here was the head of Siri using the word embarrassing about our most visible AI product. The fallout hit fast. A federal consumer lawsuit accused Apple of false advertising. A shareholder suit alleged my own words about Siri's timeline had misled investors. Not just the product, but what I said about it. I lost confidence in AI chief John Giannandrea's ability to execute. Siri oversight shifted to Mike Rockwell, the executive who built Vision Pro. The Associated Press described Apple's WWDC 2025 as underwhelming on AI. CNBC called the rollout marred by delays and underwhelming features, and noted Wall Street anxiety over Apple's AI struggles. At $3.8 trillion in market value, looking uncertain isn't a PR problem. It's a gravitational event. And here's the detail most people missed, the one that carries the most irony. When we launched the first Apple Intelligence features in October 2024, I integrated ChatGPT into Siri. the company that built its own chips, its own operating system, its own retail stores, its own payment rails, had to bring in an outside model to fill a gap in its own assistant. We built privacy protections around it, obscured IP addresses, no request storage by OpenAI. But the architecture was clear. I made that call, and I knew what it meant. That is not failure, but it is a crack. And at Apple, cracks are worth watching closely. If this perspective on Apple is landing differently than the usual coverage, subscribe. I dig into the real mechanics behind stories like this every week. And stick around, because what's coming next is the part that doesn't show up in the press releases. Alright, remember how I said there was something harder than the Siri delays? Here it is. On March 24, 2026, 8 days before Apple's 50th anniversary, Apple published security notes for iOS 26.3. On a plain white web page, in flat legal language, sat a disclosure about a vulnerability that could allow arbitrary code execution. And then, one sentence Apple only uses when things are serious. The issue may have been exploited in an extremely sophisticated attack against specific targeted individuals. That sentence appeared against the same visual backdrop as instructions for resetting an AirTag. No drama. Just the clinical truth that someone, somewhere, found a way in. This doesn't mean Apple is uniquely insecure. Craig Federighi called Apple's private cloud compute architecture the most advanced security architecture ever deployed for cloud AI at scale. Apple even publishes production software images so independent researchers can verify what code is actually running. Not just take our word for it. That's transparency most companies won't attempt. But here's what that advisory means. Even Apple cannot fully seal itself against elite offensive campaigns. And in the AI era, the attack surface grows with every new capability. Apple Intelligence integrates with your messages, your calendar, your photos, your location context. More integration means more to protect. Every security disclosure that lands while I'm simultaneously promising privacy-first AI carries extra weight. And then there's this. In January 2025, Apple agreed to pay $95 million to settle a lawsuit accusing Siri of secretly recording private conversations. No admission of guilt. Apple denied wrongdoing. But I have called privacy a fundamental human right. I've built that promise into billboards, keynotes, and the company's moral identity. And the product I was simultaneously pledging to transform into a brilliant AI assistant settled eavesdropping allegations for $95 million. Siri is not just a product in this story. Siri is a symbol of what we promised, of what slipped, of what it cost. Here's the hardest argument, the one I sit with. Apple's principles are real engineering constraints, not just language. On-device AI is harder within mobile hardware limits. Privacy restrictions reduce the data collection competitor models use to improve rapidly. The closed ecosystem limits the public beta culture that lets rivals iterate at speed. OpenAI shipped 4 major model updates in 2025 alone. Google's iteration cadence runs on continuous public feedback loops at a scale Apple's architecture was never designed to match. What if the very qualities that made late but better work for the iPod, the iPhone, and the Apple Watch are structurally incompatible with how AI gets better? Apple's greatest strength and its greatest constraint may now be the same thing. The discipline, the patience, the refusal to ship what it can't fully control. For 50 years, that was the moat. In the AI era, it may also be the speed limit. My answer is still trust. Your trust drives us to do better. I tied Apple Intelligence directly to the 50th anniversary, because I believe the AI bet is the same bet as the founding bet. Privacy, integration, precision, trust. That is either wisdom or wishful thinking. And right now, in April 2026, the market hasn't decided which. Apple at 50, not a company in crisis, but a company at a philosophical crossroads. The creed worked for half a century. Now it faces the one arena where patience itself might be the liability. The question haunting this birthday is whether late but better is a philosophy or a limitation. In AI, those two things may now be the same. If this story hit differently than the usual Apple coverage, share it with someone who thinks about where tech is actually going. And subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. Next up, what happens when the most valuable company in history has to decide whether to stay itself or change to survive? See you there.